My name is Alicia Monroe, and I'm 29 years old. This all happened in the late summer of last year, when I decided to pack up my life and my aging RV and embark on a solo adventure through Indiana's wild places. I've always been drawn to the forests, lakes, and trails that dot the Hoosier State. But nothing prepared me for the horrors that would unfold on this journey. Looking back, I can't quite say what compelled me to keep going once things started to get strange. But I suppose curiosity and a sense of wonder can be powerful motivators, even when fear gnaws at your insides. I should probably clarify. I'm not a thrill seeker by nature. My closest friends often describe me as cautious, careful with my words and plans. Yet something about the idea of stepping out of my comfort zone, living on the road in my RV, seized hold of me during a restless phase of my life. In my late 20s, I was feeling stuck, treading water in a dull office job, nursing a heartbreak I couldn't seem to shake. The open highway promised freedom. The Indiana wilderness offered a sense of possibility. So in mid-August, I took all my savings, quit my job, and said goodbye to my tiny studio apartment in Indianapolis. I loaded my battered white RV with supplies, canned goods, flashlights, batteries, a basic toolkit, and everything I'd need to camp off-grid for stretches at a time. My plan was simple: zigzag across the state, stopping at some of the best-known natural attractions, as well as a few hidden gems I'd discovered by combing obscure travel forums. My first stop was Hoosier National Forest, specifically near the German Ridge campground. The moment I parked under the towering hardwoods, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The late afternoon sun cast golden beams through the canopy, and the hum of cicadas provided a soothing soundtrack. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: solitude and serenity. I set up camp quickly, placing folding chairs outside the RV, firing up a small grill for dinner, and taking in the deep green around me. The evening passed without incident, just me and the quiet hush of the forest. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found the courage to do this, to embrace the unknown. Little did I know, the unknown was about to embrace me in ways I could never have anticipated. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of what I can only describe as scratching. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, I chalked it up to raccoons or a stray branch scraping against the RV in the breeze. When I flicked on a lantern and peered through the window, I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of trees. I tried to go back to sleep, but the scratching continued, moving along the sides of the RV as though something, or someone, was circling around it. My heart thudded in my chest. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight, steeled my nerves, and opened the door. The forest was still. No wind, no rustling undergrowth, nothing. Yet the moment my feet touched the ground, I heard a sharp crack of a branch near the tree line. I whipped my flashlight beam toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something tall, humanoid, but elongated in a way that made my stomach flip. It moved so fast it was nearly a blur. I only saw the silhouette, but its shape suggested impossibly long limbs. Then it vanished into the darkness. I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, heart hammering. I sat there for hours, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I discovered footprints around my campsite, long, narrow tracks that appeared to alternate between 2 feet and 4, as though this thing walked bipedally at times and on all fours at others. Rationally, I told myself it could be an odd trick of the mud, maybe deer tracks overlapping human footprints. But a deeper part of me knew better. I packed up my RV soon after, deciding I'd move on. Before I exited the campground, I ran into Joseph, a park ranger near the main office. He was a lean man in his early 40s, sporting a mustache and a friendly but wary smile. I asked if he'd seen anything strange overnight. His expression dimmed, and he hesitated. "There are stories," he finally said, choosing his words carefully. "Local legends of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, creatures that roam the forest at night. Most people just shrug them off. He told me to be careful if I continued exploring remote areas, adding that the forest has its share of predators, both animal and otherwise. He wouldn't elaborate, but the gravity in his voice made me shiver. I thanked him, hopped into my RV, and decided I'd try a safer place. Perhaps a more populated state park would ease my mind. My next stop was Brown County State Park, specifically near Ogle Lake. My nerves were still rattled from Hoosier National Forest, so I arrived in the early afternoon, hoping daylight would give me courage. Brown County was bustling with summer visitors, families on bikes, folks enjoying picnics, and the presence of other humans made me feel less alone. I found a decent campsite with RV hookups. After chatting with a few fellow campers, I decided to spend the evening relaxing. I grilled a simple meal, wrote in my journal, and watched the sun dip beneath the trees. As darkness gathered, people trickled back to their own tents and campers. Soft conversation and distant laughter drifted on the breeze, comforting sounds that lulled me into a sense of security. Around 9, I heard the unmistakable sound of a child laughing. It was high-pitched, playful, echoing across the water of Ogle Lake. I smiled, assuming a group was out for a late stroll. However, as the night wore on, I realized the laughter persisted, sporadic and strangely close to my RV, closer than any other camp. Around 11, just as I was dozing off, a loud giggle jolted me awake. It was right outside my window. My stomach lurched. Why would a child be out here, alone, at this hour? I mustered my courage and peered out. In the moonlight, I saw the small figure of what appeared to be a boy, maybe 8 years old, standing a few feet from my RV. His face was pale, and he wore oddly old-fashioned clothes, a collared shirt and shorts that looked decades out of style. "Hey, kid," I called softly, sliding the window open a crack. "Are you lost?" He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, and I caught a glimpse of his eyes, 2 black, empty sockets. My voice died in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't breathe or look away from that horrifying visage. Then, with a jolt of motion, the child darted behind a tree, giggling once more, the sound warping into something more like a rasp. My hands shook violently as I closed the window and locked it. I spent the rest of the night in a terrified haze, lights on, hugging my knees. In the morning, the area around my campsite looked perfectly normal, no footprints or clues. But that image, those black hollows where eyes should be, was burned into my mind. At this point, any sensible person would have gone home. Driven back to Indianapolis, found an apartment, resumed some semblance of normal life. But something in me, call it stubbornness, curiosity, or madness, drove me to keep going. I told myself these encounters were flukes, local myths brought to life by my overactive imagination. Perhaps I'd become hypervigilant, seeing things that weren't there. The truth, I think, was that some malevolent force had started to follow me, or at least to appear wherever I went. I felt it in my bones, a sense that there was a cloak of darkness trailing behind my RV, waiting for nightfall to pounce. Yet I refused to acknowledge it fully, hoping the next place might be kinder. My third destination was Morgan Monroe State Forest, near the Stebbins Cabin Trail. I'd heard wonderful things about the old-growth forest, the scenic ridges, and the sense of solitude. Yet solitude, I was beginning to learn, came with its own dangers. I found a secluded spot, well off the main road. Perhaps seeking isolation had been my first mistake, but I couldn't shake my craving for peace. After I set up camp, I spent the evening exploring a short section of trail, marveling at the towering trees and the hush that fell over the forest at twilight. That night, I awoke to a soft, rhythmic sound. At first I thought it was wind through the pines, but as I listened more carefully, I recognized a pattern, a low, humming chant. Something about it raised the hairs on the back of my neck. It was like hearing a foreign language repeated over and over, a slow incantation that carried menace in its cadence. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the RV door, stepping outside into the thick darkness. The chanting grew louder. Heart pounding, I followed the sound through a narrow path. Within a few dozen steps, I reached a small clearing lit by faint moonlight. My flashlight beam fell on a circle of tall, pale figures clad in hooded cloaks. They stood around a crude altar made of stacked stones. I couldn't make out their faces under the hoods, but one figure turned, and in the reflection of my light, I saw eyes that shimmered white, no iris, no pupil, just a milky sheen that made my gut clench. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a collective hiss. The figure nearest me let out a shriek so high-pitched I felt it vibrate in my chest. My flight instinct kicked in, and I bolted back toward my campsite, somehow navigating the uneven ground without falling. The chanting restarted behind me, faster, more frenzied. I dove into my RV, locked everything, and sat with my back against the door, tears streaming down my face. The chanting outside rose to a fever pitch, surrounding my RV like a sonic cage. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Total silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I never saw them leave. I couldn't muster the courage to look, but eventually the forest's regular night sounds returned. I waited until dawn before emerging, discovering a series of symbols etched into the dirt near the path. They looked like runes or sigils, their lines intersecting in geometric patterns. I left Morgan Monroe that morning, feeling more shaken than ever. Still, I pressed on, convinced that if I could just complete this trip, I'd reclaim my sense of power over my own life. Needing a drastic change of scenery, I headed north to Indiana Dunes State Park on the shores of Lake Michigan. The idea of sunlight bouncing off the sand and the bustling beach crowds offered me a shred of hope. If anything, I reasoned, the wide-open spaces of the lakefront would leave less room for hidden terrors. I arrived in the afternoon, found a space in the RV campground, and spent the remaining daylight exploring the dunes. I even tackled part of the 3-dune challenge trail, feeling a surge of pride at the physical exertion. For a few hours, I managed to forget the horrors I'd witnessed, reveling in the crashing waves and the warm sand under my feet. After sunset, most visitors retreated to their hotels or campsites. The wind picked up, creating a haunting whistle as it swept across the dune slopes. I decided to walk along the water's edge for a bit, hoping the rhythmic lapping of the lake would soothe my nerves. That's when I saw it, a tall, formless shadow cast upon a towering dune. At first, I assumed it was my own shadow distorted by the moonlight, but it moved in a way that didn't correspond to my steps. It stretched across the sand, impossibly long arms swaying. I froze, watching as the silhouette seemed to detach itself from the slope, standing upright. Then it advanced along the ridge, drifting smoothly over the sand as though unaffected by gravity. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat. The figure began to emit a low, droning moan filled with anguish. Suddenly, it vanished. I stood there, paralyzed, searching for any sign of movement. My instincts screamed at me to run back to my RV. Just as I turned to flee, the shadow reappeared at the base of the dune, now only a dozen yards away. It loomed over me, no features except twin pits where eyes might be. A sense of despair hit me with an almost physical force, like it was feeding me its own sorrow. I let out a scream and sprinted toward the campground. Every few seconds I glanced back to see the shadow gliding across the sand, keeping pace. Only when I reached the well-lit area near the park's welcome center did it melt away, dissolving back into the night. That evening I slept with every lamp inside the RV turned on, but I barely slept at all. The wind battered the sides of the vehicle, reminding me of that moaning wail. Although my nerves were frayed, I felt compelled to visit one last location. I'd heard rumors of an eerie place near Yellowwood Lake in Yellowwood State Forest, an area sometimes called Devil's Hollow by locals. It sounded like exactly the kind of place I should avoid, but part of me was determined to confront whatever was stalking me. If I could stare it in the face, maybe I could rid myself of this creeping dread. I arrived in the late afternoon, a sense of mounting anxiety coiling in my chest. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I found a small clearing to park, not far from the lake. The moment I turned off my engine, the stillness pressed in on me, as if the forest were holding its breath. I set out for a walk along a narrow footpath, trying to calm my mind by focusing on the little details. The crackle of leaves underfoot, the smell of damp earth, the distant sound of water lapping the shore. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind every tree, from within every shadow. By dusk, I returned to my RV, made a simple dinner, and tried to read a book. But my eyes kept flicking up to the windows. With each passing hour, the tension grew until I felt suffocated. Then, sometime around midnight, a gust of wind rattled the trees, and I heard a faint, rasping voice. It called my name. I froze, every muscle taut. That voice, it was cracked, ancient, like the voice of an old woman who'd spent too many years screaming. Alicia, it croaked again, closer this time. My heart hammered so loud I could barely hear. Gathering my courage, I looked out the window. Amid the swaying silhouettes of the trees, I saw her. An old woman in a tattered cloak, hair matted and white, eyes gleaming with a sickly yellow light. Her mouth hung open, revealing blackened teeth, and she raised a bony finger to point directly at me. I wish I could say I ran. Instead, a bizarre numbness took hold, locking me in place. A wave of whispers filled my head, like thousands of voices chanting my name. I don't know how I broke free, but at some point, my survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed my keys, threw open the RV door, and was met by a wall of wind and swirling leaves. She stood there, mere feet away. The stench of decay rolled off her, so overpowering I gagged. She whispered something, a string of syllables that made no sense to me, and my entire body tensed. I swung my flashlight beam at her, but the moment the light touched her form, she let out a feral shriek and staggered back. Seizing the chance, I lunged into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and gunned the engine. The old woman howled, slamming her hands onto the side of the RV, leaving streaks of some dark, viscous substance behind. I roared out of the clearing, branches scraping the windows as I tore down the dirt road, ignoring every bump and hazard in my path. For miles, I drove in a blind panic, not caring about the direction, only desperate to put distance between me and that nightmare figure. When I finally reached a main road, dawn was breaking. My hands cramped from how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel. I pulled into a rest stop, turned off the engine, and burst into tears. For minutes, maybe hours, I wept uncontrollably. The events of the past days crashing over me in a torrent of fear and disbelief. Once I managed to calm down, I examined the outside of the RV. My stomach lurched at the sight of the dark streaks left by the old woman. They were already dry, resembling black tar, and they spelled out strange symbols I couldn't decipher. Despite my horror, I wiped them off with gloves and some rags, then washed the area with bleach. I felt no relief. Some vile presence had attached itself to me, or so it seemed. How else could I explain the escalating encounters at every stop? Part of me wondered if I should go to the police, but what would I say? Another part of me considered returning to Joseph at Hoosier National Forest. Maybe he knew more about these legends, but I doubted any ranger's knowledge could dispel the evil I'd witnessed. Out of sheer desperation, I decided to visit an old friend in Bloomington, a short drive from Yellowwood State Forest. Her name was Rita, a folklore grad student at Indiana University. If anyone could make sense of these horrors, it might be her. I called ahead, voice trembling, and she agreed to meet me at her small apartment off campus. When I arrived, I must have looked half-crazed. Puffy eyes, unkempt hair, clothes stained with dirt and sweat. Rita listened intently as I recounted my experiences, her brow furrowed with concern and a spark of fascination. She disappeared into her bedroom, rummaging through shelves of textbooks, old manuscripts, and scholarly articles. Eventually, she produced a battered leather-bound journal. "This might help," she said, flipping through pages of archaic writing and odd symbols. "It's a collection of local legends about shapeshifters, cursed spirits, witches, and demonic entities tied to the land. Some date back to early settlers' accounts." We spent the afternoon comparing my stories to various entries. One passage mentioned a spectral child near Brown County, rumored to have drowned in the lake decades ago and returned as a lost spirit. Another described clandestine cult activities in Morgan Monroe, complete with chants and ceremonies rumored to summon malevolent forces. She found references to a shadow of the dunes, an ancient, sorrowful presence that predated modern settlement around Lake Michigan. Finally, we came upon an entry describing an old witch rumored to inhabit the deep woods of Yellowwood, cursing trespassers with runic markings. The author mentioned that once someone encountered her, she would follow them until they either left the state or something worse happened. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I read the words. "It's like everything you've experienced is connected," Rita whispered. "Or at least, you've stumbled into multiple layers of local lore. Honestly, Alicia, you should get out of here. Go anywhere but Indiana for a while. Break the chain." I knew she was right. Something had entwined itself with me, and if the stories held any truth, the best solution was to flee. I thanked Rita, hugging her tightly, though my face was still streaked with tears of panic and exhaustion. That very evening, I pointed my RV south, aiming to leave Indiana entirely. Each mile that passed under my tires offered a slight sense of relief, as if an invisible tether was stretching, trying to hold me back. The further I got from Yellowwood, the lighter my chest felt. Still, my nerves were raw. Every shadow on the highway, every flicker of headlights in my mirrors, made my heart leap. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, half expecting to see that old woman's face pressed against my side window. But it never happened. For hours, I drove in tense silence, the drone of the engine my only companion. At last, the sign welcoming me to Kentucky appeared on the interstate. I crossed the state line at dawn, the sky a pink wash of early morning light. An immense wave of emotion crashed over me, relief mingling with lingering terror. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I pulled off at the first rest stop, parked under a cluster of tall oaks, and let myself cry, letting the exhaustion pour out of me. It's been several months since that final frantic drive out of Indiana, and I haven't returned. I found a small place in southern Kentucky, near the border, where I've been trying to piece my life back together. My RV sits in the driveway, half emptied of the supplies I once cherished as symbols of freedom. I still dream about those nights in Hoosier National Forest and Brown County, about the chanting in Morgan Monroe and the shadow along the dunes. But the worst nightmares are always of that old crone outside my RV at Yellowwood, her bony finger pointing at me, her foul breath filling my nostrils. Some nights, I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I hear the scratching of nails on metal. Other times, I see flashes of a child's face with black hollows for eyes, or catch a glimpse of a tall silhouette in my peripheral vision. I tell myself it's just residual trauma. But a small, terrified part of me wonders if these things ever really let you go. Rita occasionally calls, checking in on me. She says she's found more accounts of travelers who've encountered one or two of these phenomena, but never someone who faced all of them in a single trip. Whether I was extraordinarily unlucky or targeted by something that used these legends as a twisted tapestry, I can't be sure. I do know that I'm alive, which is more than some of those old stories can say for their protagonists. And maybe that's the best I can hope for. A chance to keep living, keep moving forward, and try to bury these experiences in the recesses of my mind. Postscript. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever return to Indiana, to those forests and dunes and haunted hollows. A part of me misses the serenity of a quiet evening under the stars, the simple joy of a campfire at dusk. But then I remember the footprints circling my RV, the child's laughter that turned into a rasp, the chanting figures in white hoods, the moaning shadow on the dunes, and the old witch's grin. I suppose each of us carries our own darkness, our own nightmares. Mine just happened to have taken on flesh, bone, and ancient malevolence in the heart of the Hoosier state. If you ever find yourself wandering those trails in Indiana, Hoosier National Forest, Brown County State Park, Morgan Monroe State Forest, Indiana Dunes, or Yellowwood, be wary. Listen closely to the whisper of the wind. Pay attention to the shapes that flit at the edge of your vision. And if you hear chanting at midnight or see footprints that change from 2 to 4 legs or glimpse a figure with hollow eyes, do not ignore the warning signs. As for me, my name is Alicia Monroe, and I'm 29 years old, forever marked by an odyssey through darkness I never should have witnessed. I still have the RV, and sometimes I think about taking it on the road again, just to see if the terror was real or some twisted dream. But then I recall the runic markings etched into the dirt, the echoes of that chanting, and the nightmares that followed. For now, I'll choose safety over curiosity, and I pray that whatever lurks in those Indiana woods, dunes, and hollows remains there, sated by the fear it's already consumed. If you're reading this, take my story as a caution. The wilderness can be beautiful and liberating, yes, but it can also hide ancient, insidious forces waiting for a weary traveler to stumble across their path. Don't let that traveler be you. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and if you sense something's not right, it's probably already too late. My name is Danielle Harlow, and I'm 35 years old. This all happened just a few months ago, at a time when my life felt as though it were on the brink of collapse. I'd been living in Chicago, working a grueling corporate job that left me hollow inside, and on top of it all, my marriage had just fallen apart. One evening, after a final terse phone call with my ex-husband's lawyer, I snapped. I couldn't breathe in that city anymore. I felt trapped by the steel towers, the endless concrete, the memory-laced apartment. So I threw what I could into my old RV, my clothes, some camping supplies, half a box of old DVDs, and I drove south, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they went numb. I didn't have much of a plan. I just knew I wanted to find a place where I could empty my mind of all the heartbreak and noise. Late one night, while scanning through possible outdoor escapes on my phone, I stumbled on Lake Monroe in southern Indiana, near the Paintown State Recreation Area. The online photos showed a wide expanse of shimmering water, framed by thick forests that promised solitude. That word, solitude, drew me in like a magnet. Before I could second-guess myself, I set the GPS and aimed my RV straight toward Bloomington, determined to find a campsite on Lake Monroe where I could finally breathe again. I arrived mid-afternoon on a hot, hazy Tuesday. The weather had been stormy the night before, and the sky still held a slight bruise-purple tint in the clouds. My RV sputtered and complained as I navigated the winding roads to Paintown, passing a few small stores and restaurants that looked half abandoned, half tourist trap. When I finally pulled into the campground, I was pleasantly surprised to find it relatively empty. A few tents dotted the far end of the loop, and here and there I saw another RV or pop-up camper, but it was nowhere near full. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I wanted. The park attendant, a bored-looking college kid, checked me in without much fuss. He handed me a map, circled my campsite number, and warned me to keep an eye on the weather if I planned to stay a while. Might get more storms, he said. I thanked him and rumbled off toward my designated spot, feeling the engine protest on the steep uphill bends. The moment I turned off the engine, an immense quiet surrounded me. Tall pines lined one side of the campsite, and the shimmering waters of Lake Monroe glistened a few hundred yards away, reachable by a narrow trail. I stepped out, took a deep breath, and let the scent of pine needles and damp earth fill my lungs. No honking horns, no urgent text messages, just calm. I almost cried right then, overwhelmed by the relief of it all. It took me less than an hour to get the RV stabilized, the small awning rolled out, and my folding chair set near the fire ring. Normally, I'd busy myself reading or checking emails, but something about that campground compelled me to just sit there and watch the sunlight filter through the leaves. For a short while, I felt peace wash over me, perhaps for the first time in months. As evening settled, I noticed that the campground had grown even quieter. The couple of families in tents had gone inside to escape the mosquitoes, and a few faint porch lights glowed from other RVs. Overhead, crickets and tree frogs began their nightly chorus. I grilled a quick dinner, sipped a lukewarm beer, and felt my eyelids grow heavy. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, I retreated inside, locked the door, and fell asleep to the rustle of branches against the roof. I must have slept hard because the next thing I knew, I jolted awake to a tapping noise on the side of my RV. My heart hammered. The clock read 2:14 a.m. The tapping was soft, irregular, like someone flicking a single fingernail against the metal. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon scavenging for scraps. I inched over to the window, parted the curtain an inch, and peered out into the darkness. The nearest street lamp was far enough away that it barely illuminated anything. I couldn't see a thing, just the vague shape of pines. Still, the tapping persisted. Anxiety prickled in my chest. When a particularly loud tap came just below the window, I snatched my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it through the glass. Nothing. The sound stopped. I waited for a full minute, ears straining, but all I heard were the crickets. Finally, I decided it must have been a branch swaying in the wind. Yet the air outside looked still. Sleep didn't come easy after that, but somehow, exhaustion pulled me under a while later. Morning brought bright sun and a sense of normalcy that almost made me doubt the night's events. I showered in the RV's tiny stall, ate a quick breakfast, and stepped outside to enjoy my coffee, determined to put my jitters to rest. That's when I noticed my neighbor a couple sites over, a lean, older man sitting in a folding chair with a fishing rod across his lap. He waved and called out a friendly hello. I walked over, coffee in hand, and introduced myself. His name was Tom. He looked about 60, wore a fisherman's cap, and had the deep tan of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He asked how my night had been. I hesitated, wondering if I should mention the tapping. When I did, he gave me a considering look. "You might hear weird stuff out here at Lake Monroe," he said. "There's talk among the regulars about ghost lights in the woods at night, or voices carrying across the water. I've never seen anything myself, but plenty of folks around here have stories." I chuckled politely, but a part of me tensed. I had just left a life full of stress. The last thing I needed was ghost stories. Tom must have sensed my discomfort because he changed the topic to fishing, describing the best spots to catch bass near the deeper coves. I thanked him and returned to my site, hoping that would be the end of any talk of strange happenings. That afternoon, I decided to stretch my legs and explore the paths around the lake. The pine needles made a soft carpet that hushed my footsteps. Sunlight flickered in the canopy above, dancing in a gentle breeze. For the first hour, the walk was idyllic, and I let my mind wander freely. But as I made my way around a bend closer to the shoreline, a prickle of apprehension skittered through me. I stopped, scanning the trees. Something felt off, as though the forest were holding its breath. In the distance, I heard the faintest sound of water lapping the bank. Then came a single snapping twig behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the trail was empty. No sign of a deer or rabbit or anything else that might have broken a branch. A chill ran up my arms in the warm afternoon air, and I suddenly realized how quiet the birds had become. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. A moment later, a wind gust stirred the branches and the normal forest sounds resumed. I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. Obviously, I was still raw from my life in Chicago and the tension from last night's tapping. On my way back, I ran into a park ranger near one of the boat ramps, a clean-shaven, middle-aged man with the name Harding on his badge. He nodded politely as he approached, and I took the opportunity to ask him about the area. He seemed happy to chat at first, but grew more guarded when I mentioned the weird feeling I'd had. I joked about Tom's ghost stories, but Harding didn't smile. "Folks say a caretaker went missing here a long time ago, back when they first built the reservoir," he said. "It's just a local legend, but some campers claim they've seen a figure wandering near the shore at night. If you hear anything strange, best to stay around the lit areas." With that, he tipped his hat and continued on his way. I was left with a hollow pit in my stomach, uncertain how much I should worry. That evening, I decided to sit by my fire ring as dusk gathered, determined not to let silly legends chase me off. The lake's surface turned gold and orange in the last rays of sun, and the pine trees cast long shadows across the ground. I was just starting to relax when Tom ambled over, hands in his pockets. He asked if I'd like some company, and I offered him a seat by the fire. We swapped small talk, and eventually the conversation drifted toward the caretaker legend. I couldn't help my curiosity. Tom gazed at the flickering flames for a moment before speaking. Years back, this place wasn't a lake. It was farmland and forests, and when they decided to flood the valley to create Lake Monroe, a groundskeeper or caretaker was rumored to live in a shack on the property. Name was Henry Calloway. One day, Henry vanished. Some folks suspected he drowned when the water rose, or that he was buried in a section of land no one got to in time. Others said he was into weird stuff, folk magic, conjuring spells. If you ask me, it's all tall tales, but there's enough odd stories around here to keep the rumor alive. I felt a cold knot form in my chest, but I refused to let paranoia cripple me again. Tom excused himself soon after, and I stayed up, staring into the fire until only embers remained. Before finally crawling into my RV, I glanced around the pines, half expecting to see a figure in overalls lurking among them. All I saw was darkness. That night, something far more disturbing than tapping woke me. A faint, rhythmic slapping sound, almost like wet hands hitting the metal sides of the RV. Groggy and trembling, I flipped on a lantern and pressed my ear to the window. Through the thin walls, I heard something akin to raspy breathing. Swallowing my fear, I cracked the curtain open, shining my lantern outside. There, illuminated in the weak beam, stood a figure at the edge of my campsite. His shape was indistinct, almost translucent, and my mind raced. He wore what looked like overalls, and the broad outline of his shoulders had patches of darkness instead of solid flesh. Then he moved, turning toward me, and I saw his face, hollow, milky eyes, and a mouth that seemed unnaturally wide. My blood chilled. I gasped, the lantern shaking in my grip. In that split second, the figure flickered and dissolved, as if it were made of fog. No footprints remained, no sign he had even been there. I spent the rest of the night cowering under my blankets, every muscle tense. Daybreak found me exhausted, with eyes gritty from lack of sleep. I went outside, half expecting to see some proof of what I'd witnessed, but the campsite was in its usual state of peaceful stillness. Had I imagined it? My heart told me otherwise. Tom, noticing my haggard appearance, invited me to ride into the nearby town with him for supplies. I hesitated, but ultimately agreed, craving the reassurance of civilization. As we drove, I confided in him about what I'd seen. He nodded solemnly, not seeming shocked. There's a little library in town, he said. Might be old records there we can dig through. Who knows? Maybe we'll find some clue about Henry Calloway. The library turned out to be a modest brick building that smelled of dust and aged paper. We approached the elderly librarian, who looked surprised by our interest in local history. She pointed us toward a small archive room with a handful of boxes labeled Lake Monroe Construction. We rummaged through old newspaper clippings and black and white photos. Finally, we found an article from the mid-1960s. It mentioned a caretaker named Henry Calloway, who disappeared under strange circumstances shortly before the valley was flooded. One snippet suggested foul play, while another said Henry dabbled in occult traditions, citing an anonymous neighbor's testimony. I felt a chill reading the words. We also discovered a glass display case near the back of the library containing memorabilia from the area's past. Inside was an old tarnished key labeled Caretaker's Key, apparently found at the site years after Henry vanished. A small note read that it belonged to the caretaker's shack, though details were sparse. My imagination went wild thinking about Henry wandering, searching for that key. Tom muttered something about restless spirits, but quickly went silent as the librarian walked by. We returned to the RV park in uneasy silence. For the next day or two, I tried to carry on normally. I fished at the lake's edge, read a worn paperback novel, and tried my best to ignore the uneasy feelings that nagged at me whenever the sun dipped low. Ranger Harding crossed paths with me again and asked in a careful tone if everything was all right. I debated telling him about the apparition, but decided against it, worried I'd sound delusional. He merely reminded me to stick to the lit areas, which did nothing to soothe my nerves. My nights became a torturous cycle of half-sleep, jerking awake at the slightest sound. Often, I heard what could have been breathing outside, or saw faint flickers of light through the curtains. One particularly bad night, I swore I heard chanting drifting from the woods beyond my campsite. Low voices, repeating a phrase I couldn't decipher, mingled with the rustle of pine boughs. By the time I mustered the courage to look, nothing was there but swirling mist. My mind, plagued by stress, conjured the caretaker's face repeatedly in my dreams, milky eyes boring into me. Tom, concerned by my deteriorating state, suggested we do something about it. "We can't just wait for this to escalate," he said, sipping coffee outside his camper one morning. "The stories say that if Henry's spirit is out here, it's tied to this land. Maybe it needs to be released." I stared at him, unsure if I believed in such things, but also too desperate to dismiss any possibility. Together, we pored over the notes we'd collected, flipping through references to local folk magic. One scribbled margin note in an old article mentioned a cleansing ritual, though the details were hazy. By sheer luck or fate, we remembered the caretaker's key in the library display. We returned to the building, feigning more research interest. When no one was looking, Tom carefully lifted the glass case. It was unlocked, apparently not high security, and took the tarnished key. We left a short note behind with our contact information, promising to return it. I still feel guilty about that theft, or borrowing, as Tom insisted we call it, but we were scared and convinced we needed it. Perhaps we were both just succumbing to superstition. We gathered supplies at the local hardware store: salt, white candles, a bit of sage. Neither of us really knew what we were doing, but we'd read enough scattered references to piece together a rudimentary ritual. The plan was to go to the water's edge at midnight, lay out a circle of salt, and use the caretaker's key as a focal object to call Henry's spirit. Then we'd say a prayer or chant of release, hopefully freeing him. It all sounded absurd, but we felt we had no other option. The night we chose was damp and cool. A light mist rolled over Lake Monroe, illuminated by a moon that struggled to pierce the cloud cover. My nerves were on edge as Tom and I crept down a narrow trail to a small, secluded spot of shoreline. Every time the wind rustled the pines, I jumped, half expecting Henry's apparition to leap out at us. My breath puffed in white clouds, and a clammy sweat slicked my palms. We arrived at a patch of rocky beach, the water lapping gently a few yards away. Tom set the caretaker's key on a flat stone. I knelt, drew a circle in the gravel, and carefully sprinkled salt around its perimeter. The air felt heavier with each handful of salt, as if the atmosphere itself resisted our actions. Tom placed 3 white candles around the circle and lit them, the flames flickering wildly in the faint breeze. A sudden wind gust kicked up, carrying the smell of damp earth. The flames danced higher, but they didn't blow out. I pulled a crumpled piece of paper from my pocket, on which we'd scrawled a rough incantation based on the references we found. My voice trembled as I began to speak. "Henry Calloway, caretaker of these grounds, restless soul bound to the water and the land, we call on you to hear our plea. By salt and flame, we offer you release from this earthly tether." A blast of cold air cut me off, almost knocking me off balance. The lake's surface began to stir, tiny waves slapping the shore with greater force. Tom steadied me, urging me to continue. I repeated the words, louder this time, my heart thudding so hard I felt it in my throat. The wind howled, and suddenly, the mist along the shoreline started to churn and rise. I squinted through the swirling fog and saw a shape forming. At first, it was just a blur like a trick of the light. Then it solidified into the figure I'd seen before. A tall man in overalls, his edges shimmering as though he were half submerged in water. His face was turned away, but he slowly rotated to face us, revealing those dreadful, milky eyes. An unearthly moan ripped through the air, one part sorrow, one part rage. My pulse slammed against my ribs, but I forced myself to keep speaking the incantation. Be freed, Henry Calloway, from the binds that hold you here. Return to peace, or pass beyond. By this key, the seal is broken. I grabbed the caretaker's key from the stone and held it out. The figure advanced, each step across the rocky shore accompanied by a gurgling sound, like water pouring from a broken dam. Tom fumbled with a lighter, trying to keep the candles burning bright, but the wind threatened to snuff them out. Henry's spirit halted at the edge of the salt circle. He lifted one hand, pallid and dripping with some spectral fluid, and pressed it against an invisible barrier. That moan deepened, resonating in the pit of my stomach. His mouth stretched wider, forming a silent scream. The air inside the circle grew heavier, almost crushing my lungs. I repeated the final line of the incantation 3 times, each utterance bolder than the last, my voice shaking but determined. With a violent roar, the figure jerked backward, the water near the shore surging up in response. For a horrifying moment, it looked as though Henry's spirit might leap across the boundary. Then, as if pulled by invisible threads, he collapsed into the roiling mist, his body dissolving into ribbons of shadow. A blast of cold wind hit us, and the waves on the lake pounded against the stones in a crescendo of chaotic energy. Tom and I shielded our faces until, without warning, the wind died. The lake stilled. Silence fell over the shoreline. For a long while, neither of us moved. My knees wobbled so badly I had to lean on Tom to stay upright. The circle of salt remained on the ground, the candles sputtering but still lit. Slowly the mist receded, drifting back onto the lake in soft tendrils. My entire body trembled with adrenaline and relief. There was no sign of Henry's spirit. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. We heard a branch snap behind us, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But it was Ranger Harding, rushing down the trail with a flashlight. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, his beam dancing over the circle, the salt, our pale faces. Tom and I looked at each other, unsure how to explain. Harding's eyes flicked to the caretaker's key in my trembling hand. He scowled, but somehow he didn't press for details. Perhaps he saw enough to suspect that something beyond rational explanation had just happened. A half hour later, the 3 of us sat around a burnt-out campfire near my RV, the adrenaline crash leaving me nauseated and exhausted. Harding demanded we return the caretaker's key and keep quiet about our escapade. "Whatever you did," he said, rubbing his temples, "I hope it works. We don't need more rumors scaring campers away." We swore we'd put it back, and Tom, looking strangely resolved, promised we wouldn't cause more trouble. Dawn brought a surreal calm to the campground. The pines smelled fresher, and the sunlight reflected cheerily off the lake. For the first time since I arrived, I felt an emotional lightness, as though a crushing weight had been lifted. Despite the relief, exhaustion weighed me down, and I collapsed into a deep, dreamless sleep for a few hours. When I woke near lunchtime, Tom was waiting with a thermos of coffee. We looked at each other, disbelief still etched on our faces. Yet we both felt certain that Henry Calloway's spirit had been laid to rest, or at least banished from this stretch of shoreline. I spent the rest of that day in a fog of quiet introspection. My entire reason for coming here was to escape the wreckage of my life in Chicago, and I'd ended up facing a nightmare far more tangible and terrifying than I'd ever expected. Yet paradoxically, confronting that fear had sharpened something in me. I felt a flicker of strength, a sense of self I thought I'd lost in the midst of divorce papers and corporate deadlines. By the following morning, I decided it was time to leave Lake Monroe. Not because I was still afraid, I wasn't, at least not in the same way, but because I felt I'd found what I needed, a reminder that I could face the unknown and survive. Tom helped me pack my RV. We walked together to the library in town, explaining sheepishly that we'd borrowed the caretaker's key for historical research. The librarian wasn't pleased, but she didn't press charges. We set the key back in its display case, and I stared at the tarnished metal for a moment, imagining it as the final tether for Henry's restless spirit. I climbed into the RV around midday, with Tom standing by the campground entrance, hat in hand. He tipped it once in goodbye. Ranger Harding wasn't there, but I had a feeling he was watching from somewhere, making sure we left without further incident. As I pulled onto the main road, my hands shook with both excitement and a lingering trace of fear. The trees and farmland sped by, and once I hit the highway, I aimed for somewhere south, maybe Kentucky, maybe further. The future felt as open as the horizon stretching ahead of me. Hours later, I reached a rest stop just over the Kentucky border and decided to catch my breath. I stepped out, letting the warm breeze wash over my face. The memory of Henry's apparition still gave me chills if I dwelled on it too long, but I also felt a quiet satisfaction that I'd stood my ground. Glancing in the RV's side mirror, I saw the reflection of the road behind me. For a split second, I imagined a figure standing at the edge of the forest, tall and silent. I blinked, and it was gone, just a play of shadows in my tired mind. I can't say for certain if Henry's spirit was truly put to rest. Maybe a fragment of him lingers around Lake Monroe, bound to the place where he once lived and died. But I know that I, for one, left with a renewed sense of purpose. My time there taught me that some ghosts exist not just in haunted lands, but in the corners of our own hearts, memories, regrets, fears that follow us wherever we go. Facing them, rather than running, is the only real way to find peace. I've moved on from Chicago now, carving out a new path in life. My RV is still my companion, though I've ventured beyond Indiana's borders to explore other horizons. From time to time, I'll recall the pine-scented air of Lake Monroe, the hush that fell across the campsite at dusk, and those milky, unblinking eyes peering from the mist. I sometimes wonder if I'd go back, if only to prove that I'm no longer afraid. But for now, I'm content to keep driving, to keep searching for the kind of calm that wraps around you like a warm blanket in the night. Whatever else happens, I know one thing. I faced a darkness deeper than my own heartbreak, and I came out of it changed. And that, to me, is enough of a victory to keep going.